In this video, we'll look at an underperforming market. So if our full employment level of real GDP is pegged at $18 trillion and we have a market that is underperforming, what does that mean? Well, let's look at our long-run aggregate supply curve. And let's see what happens when our long-run aggregate supply curve is not in a long-run equilibrium with our short-run market. Well, if our aggregate demand curve and our aggregate supply curve intersect, so this is our aggregate demand curve and our aggregate supply curve in the short run aggregate supply. If they intersect to the left of our long run aggregate supply curve, that means that if we look at where this intersects with our GDP, that we are currently at a level that is less than our full employment or potential level of GDP. Okay, so right here we have what's called a recessionary gap. A recessionary gap is the distance from our long run aggregate supply curve to equilibrium in our short run market. So that right there is a recessionary gap. So here we have a recessionary gap of $500 billion, okay, $500 billion, $500 billion. Now, if we look at what our price level is determined by the short run, so this is our current equilibrium price level. So when our potential is less than our full employment level of real GDP, we have a recessionary gap. In a recessionary gap, our current GDP or our actual GDP is less than our full employment level of GDP. That means that we have an increase in unemployment and a reduction in gross domestic product. So we're away from our mark. We need to have some sort of an increase in gross domestic product to bring us to our full employment level of real GDP. In the next video series, we'll look at the difference between the classical approach to fixing this problem as opposed to a more Keynesian approach. But here we could get to our full employment level of real GDP two different ways. Obviously, if we have an increase in our short-run aggregate supply curve, that would bring us to our full employment level of real GDP. If we had an increase in our short-run aggregate supply curve, that would bring us to our full employment level of real GDP. So if we went to short-run aggregate supply curve 1, if we had some sort of an increase, that would increase our output and at the same time lower our price level. Or the other way that we could have an increase and bring us to our full employment level of real GDP is if it was demand side. If we had an increase in demand, we could see that our demand curve could shift to the right and bring us to our full employment level of real GDP. Aggregate demand sub 1. If we did that, so it's a lower price with an increase in supply. And if we use the aggregate demand and we increased aggregate demand, we'd be able to get to our full employment level of real GDP. However, there would be an increase in the price level. So with aggregate demand, we would see that the price level would increase. But both of these things would bring us to our full employment level of real GDP, which is where our aggregate supply curve and our aggregate demand curve are intersecting with our long run aggregate supply curve.